The guest signed the ledger without saying a word. Just 4 letters, sharp and slanted, maybe a last name, maybe not. He didn't ask for Wi-Fi, didn't ask about breakfast or checkout. He just took the key, nodded once, and walked out into the storm with his duffel bag dragging in the snow. The next morning, room 12 was empty, but the mattress was soaked through, and the lights had been unscrewed from every lamp. I still have the key in my drawer, and I still don't know what he wanted. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever worked a job that got real strange after midnight. And if these stories help pass the quiet hours, consider following the channel so you don't miss the next one. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 the winter this happened, working front desk at a rustic mountain lodge in western Colorado, the kind of place that gets buried in snow from November through March. Back then, I'd been living in Glenwood Springs for about 6 years, working split shifts and trading stories with whoever wandered in off the highway. The lodge was old creaky wood floors, thick quilted drapes, and these cast iron keys that guests loved because they made the place feel authentic. We didn't have digital locks, and we only got cell service on the west-facing side of the parking lot. Most nights were quiet. A few skiers, maybe a lost traveler or two, nothing you'd write home about. But that February, the first week of the month, a storm rolled through and stranded a dozen of us up on the ridge for 3 days straight. And on the second night, that's when we had a guest check in that no one ever really saw leave. It was the kind of snow that hushes everything. Thick, steady, and too heavy for wind to push around. You'd open the front door, and it was just white silence, stretching out in every direction like a photograph. The plows hadn't come through since morning, and we already had over 2 feet piling up against the west windows. I was on the 3 to midnight shift, sitting behind the front desk with a paperback and a space heater aimed at my feet. Len Turner, our overnight maintenance guy, was in the back watching some fishing show on low volume. Around 9:30 that night, the power dipped not out entirely. Just that flicker where everything dims for a second and you feel the hum in your teeth, the kind that makes you look up like something just entered the room. I was already reaching for the flashlight when the front door opened. The man who came in didn't shake the snow off like most do. He just stepped inside and stood there, letting it melt on the floor around him. He was wearing an old green canvas coat, the kind with the shearling collar, and he carried a duffel bag that looked heavy and half-frozen. No gloves, no hat, just pale hands red from the cold and eyes that didn't seem to focus on anything. I asked if he had a reservation. He didn't answer, just stepped forward and looked down at the ledger. We kept a paper log, part of the charm, management said, and he picked up the pen and wrote something in a fast, slanted hand. 4 letters. Could have been Hale or Hall. I couldn't be sure. He paid in cash. Exact amount. No ID, no questions. No words at all. I gave him the key to room 12 downstairs end of the hall, and he nodded once, took it, and walked back out into the snow. I figured he was going to move his car closer, but when I peeked out the window a minute later, I didn't see any vehicles. Just footprints heading around the side of the building toward the south stairwell. I didn't think much of it then. A lot of folks parked at the overlook during storms and walked in on foot. By 10, most of the other guests were in for the night. The fire in the lobby was dying low, and the snow had blanketed everything in that odd orange glow from the sodium lights outside. I remember flipping through the local radio just to hear something. Static mostly, until I hit one channel that sounded like a voice buried under snow, faint, distant, rhythmic. I turned it off after a few seconds. It was too quiet in the lodge to be listening to something like that. Around 11:45, I went to lock the side doors. Len was already making his rounds, checking the boiler room and refilling the salt bucket. I stepped down the east stairwell past room 12 and stopped. The hallway was darker than it should have been. Two of the sconces were out, not flickering, just unscrewed. The bulbs sat in a neat row on the floor, each one placed exactly under its socket. That got my attention. I knocked gently on the door to room 12 more out of instinct than anything else. No sound, no movement. I didn't open it. We had a policy about guest privacy. But I did take a mental note. When I got back upstairs, I mentioned it to Len. He didn't say much, just frowned and said he'd take a look later. The next morning, I came in around 7 to cover for Tina, who couldn't get down the hill in the snow. Len was still there, bleary-eyed but awake, sitting in the lobby with a cup of black coffee and a look I didn't like. He told me room 12 was empty. Bed slept in mattress soaked through, like it had been sprayed with a hose, and the light bulbs, every single one, had been unscrewed, same as the ones in the hall. The window was open despite it being 15 degrees outside. No fresh snow on the sill, no footprints. Just the key lying on the dresser and a long scrape across the glass where something had scratched its way inward or outward. We pulled the ledger, double-checked the entry. Still those 4 letters. No vehicle in the lot. No footprints on the south side. No one had seen him leave, and no one saw him come back in after stepping out that first time. Management had me file an incident report for what I don't really know. There was no crime, technically. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just wrong. That kind of wrong that settles in your stomach and doesn't move for days. We closed room 12 for the rest of the season, said it had a plumbing issue. And every so often during late shifts, I'd swear I heard something down there. Just once or twice. A soft knock. A light turning off on its own. Always quiet. Always after midnight. I still have that room key. Lodge updated to electronic locks a few years ago and let us keep the old ones as souvenirs. I keep it in a drawer at home, the metal worn smooth on one side, where his thumb must have pressed. Haven't told anyone this part, but sometimes when I touch it, I hear that same static like a voice behind a snowstorm, just barely too far to understand. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those stories that starts with a joke and ends with a silence no one wants to sit in for long. You start out laughing about how paranoid it made you, but by the end of it, you're checking your rearview mirror a little more than usual. My name's Derek Hanley. I was 35 when this happened, working as a graphic designer for a small agency in Portland. That summer, my 2 closest friends, Marcus and Ethan, and I finally pulled the trigger on something we'd talked about for years. A cross-country camping trip, just the 3 of us, from Oregon to Maine. It was something we'd always put off because of jobs, relationships, or just not having the time. But that year time suddenly showed up all at once. Marcus had just been laid off from his software job, Ethan's divorce finalized in May. And me, I'd been drowning in work and needed something, anything, to remind me that life existed beyond deadlines and edits. We planned it out over beers and Google Maps. 10 states, 3 weeks, and a rough loop through the best parks and most remote campgrounds we could find. We even made a little rule, 1 photo each day. Same pose, same setup. We'd pitch our tent, set up Marcus's camera on a tripod, and take a shot of the 3 of us standing side by side, usually grinning like we were back in college again. At the time, it felt like a way to mark each stop. Now it feels like we were documenting something that was watching us from the start. The first few days were perfect. We started at Crater Lake, then cut across Idaho and into Yellowstone. Nothing but mountain air, long drives, and dumb jokes that wouldn't have been funny to anyone but us. The weather was beautiful. Clear skies, cool nights. Each photo turned out great golden hour light, the 3 of us framed by rivers or trees or the occasional campsite fire. Marcus was the one who insisted on checking each photo right after we took it. He had this nice DSLR he'd bought just for the trip, and he'd upload everything to his laptop each night to make sure nothing got lost. We even joked about turning them into a photo book one day just for us. But somewhere around Missouri, things changed. We were at a campground outside the Mark Twain National Forest. Mid-July, humid as hell, with trees so thick you could barely see 20 feet in. There were only 2 other campers, both in big RVs on the far side of the lot. Our site was tucked into a quiet corner, and we got in just as the sun was dipping low between the trees. Marcus had a harder time getting the light right that evening. The shadows were harsh, and he had to take a few versions before he was satisfied. On the last photo, just as the timer beeped, we all heard something, a branch snapping, clean and deliberate, just behind the tripod. Ethan flinched. We all did, really. Marcus grabbed the camera right away, flipped through the photos, and said everything looked fine. We were more concerned about getting the fire going and escaping the bugs. We figured maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. It didn't seem worth worrying about. 2 days later, we were in Nebraska, camping near the Niobrara River. Wide open space this time, not a tree in sight except for the thin brush near the water. It was windy, so we bunched up tighter than usual for the photo. The camera nearly tipped over, and Marcus said something about the lens being smudged. He wiped it with his shirt and shrugged it off. It wasn't until Iowa that I noticed the feeling, that tightening in your chest when it gets too quiet. We were at one of those little family-run sites paid with cash in an honor box. The woman who owned it gave us a site so far from the others, we might as well have been alone. Cornfields on all sides. Flat ground, pale sky, the kind of quiet that made your ears ring. That night I couldn't sleep. Ethan kept shifting in his sleeping bag. Marcus got up twice and was gone longer than I liked. And around 3 in the morning I heard footsteps. Slow, measured. They circled the tent once and then stopped behind me. I held my breath. The steps didn't move again, just quiet, steady breathing right on the other side of the nylon. I never unzipped the flap. I just lay there perfectly still until the first hints of light started to creep through the trees. By then, the breathing had stopped. I didn't tell the others. We were all acting like nothing had changed, but I could tell they were feeling it too. The way we packed up faster, the way we stopped lingering at the fire. We didn't say it out loud, but we were nervous. By the time we reached Wisconsin, something had shifted. We were at a site near a lake surrounded by pine trees and scattered families. Normal noise again. Kids yelling, radios playing. It actually felt like a relief. Marcus decided to finally back up the last week of photos onto his laptop. I was starting the fire when I heard him gasp. A sharp, breathless sound like someone had knocked the wind out of him. Ethan and I ran over. He had the Missouri photo up on his screen, zoomed in just behind us. And there, in the trees, was someone standing. Just far enough to be blurry, just close enough to be unmistakable. A figure, tall, still, watching. We thought it might have been another camper at first, a trick of the light. But then Marcus opened the Nebraska photo. There across the river was the same shape, same posture. Farther back, but there. And the Iowa photo, that one was worse. He was closer, standing at the edge of the cornfield right behind where our tent had been. We went through every photo from the trip, South Dakota, Minnesota, even one from back in Idaho. He was in 6 of them, always just in the background, always watching. Ethan wanted to leave immediately, just pack up and drive through the night. Marcus was going through his camera roll like a man possessed, trying to see if there were more ones we hadn't noticed. I just stared out at the lake, wondering how long we'd been followed, wondering if he was out there now. We didn't continue east. We turned back toward Portland. 26 hours straight, switching drivers, stopping only for gas. Marcus took one final photo before we left the last campground. Not of us, just an empty shot of the site we'd used. He said he wanted to see if anything showed up. When we got back, we looked at that last photo. Nothing in the trees, nothing near the tent. But in the side mirror of a nearby RV, there was a face. Not detailed, but clear enough. Marcus deleted every photo but that one. Said he didn't want to take chances. He keeps it on an encrypted drive now. Ethan moved out of state a few months later. We don't talk about the trip much anymore. But every once in a while, one of us will text the others. A simple question. Have you seen him lately? So far, the answer's always been no. But I still check reflections more than I used to, and I haven't camped since. I've always been a light sleeper, but that night I heard it before I even knew I was awake, a soft, deliberate tapping, like fingers drumming against nylon. Measured patient. I glanced at my watch in the dark, and the digital numbers read 2:07 a.m. My name's Tom Rourke. I was 41 back then, working long hours as a warehouse supervisor in Atlanta, 50-hour weeks, sometimes more, when the schedules stacked up before the holidays. My wife, Sarah, had been after me to take more time with our son, Tyler, who was 12, and still at that age where camping with his dad was the best thing in the world. I knew that window would close soon, so I booked us a weekend at a remote campground in the North Georgia mountains. Just the 2 of us. I wanted to teach him how to build a real fire cook over open flame, maybe show him how to use a compass like my old man taught me. The kind of stuff I hadn't made time for in years. The place was called Whispering Pines. It sat tucked at the far end of a winding forest road about 2 hours north of the city. The trees grew tall and tight there, mostly loblolly pines that creaked in the wind even when the air felt still. We got there late Friday afternoon, and the ranger on duty, a man named Earl, looked to be in his 60s. His uniform was faded from sun, and one eye drifted just a bit, when he spoke like it couldn't quite agree on where to land. He gave us Site 47, furthest from the loop, tucked into a patch of trees so dense we couldn't even see the neighboring campsites. Tyler was thrilled, said it felt like real camping. No other kids around to embarrass himself in front of. Just forest and firewood and stars. That first night was everything I'd hoped for. We roasted hot dogs and burned marshmallows to charcoal, then sat back on the cooler while I told him about my own camping trips as a kid. Tyler asked about constellations while the fire died down, and somewhere in the middle of explaining Orion's belt, I looked over to find him asleep in his bag, chocolate still on his cheek. I sat out there for a while after that, just listening to the wind pass through the needles overhead. That peaceful quiet that only seems to exist when you're deep in the woods and everyone you care about is asleep beside you. The next day was just as good. We hiked a little trail that followed a shallow creek Earl had mentioned. Tyler tried catching minnows in his cupped hands, falling in twice, and laughing so hard I thought he'd swallowed half the stream. We spotted deer tracks and what he was convinced were bear prints, though I knew better. By nightfall, we were back at the site making campfire pizza in an old cast-iron skillet I'd lugged from home. Tyler said it was better than delivery, which made me feel weirdly proud. We turned in early that night, I'd say around 9:30 or so. My muscles ached in that good way from hiking, and Tyler was worn out from running through the woods. I fell asleep quickly, deeply even. But at 2:07 I woke up to that sound. Not random, not rustling, it was deliberate. A tap, pause, tap, like a rhythm. It came from the tent wall just inches from Tyler's sleeping bag. I held my breath, thinking maybe rain had started or a branch was moving in the wind. But there was no wind. The air inside the tent was still and cold. The tapping moved just a few inches at first, but around the tent wall, like someone walking their fingers slowly along the fabric. I didn't want to panic, but my instincts kicked in. I'd seen raccoons get bold at campsites before, but this didn't feel like that. This felt measured, controlled. I reached slowly for the flashlight beside my bag and unzipped the flap as quietly as I could. The tapping stopped the instant the zipper moved. Outside, the forest looked frozen in place. My beam swept the trees, casting long shadows that didn't seem to belong to anything. No eyeshine, no movement. The ground was dry. No wind. Just silence, so deep it felt physical. I stood there for a few minutes, bare feet cold against the packed dirt, listening. Then I circled the tent. Nothing, not a sound. I told myself it had to be a branch, maybe swaying just enough to make contact. But I still sat up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, scanning the tree line until the sky began to brighten behind the hills. Tyler woke up around 6:30, none the wiser, still talking about breakfast like nothing had happened. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to scare him. We stepped out into the cold morning air, and that's when we saw them 5 pine cones. Not scattered, not dropped. Arranged in a perfect circle right at the tent's entrance. Each one placed equidistant from the next, about 2 feet across. They were long white pine cones, still sticky with sap. The thing is, Whispering Pines was full of loblolly trees which drop shorter, rounder cones. White pines didn't grow anywhere near that campsite. I knew because I'd studied the trail map the day before. Tyler thought it was some sort of art project I'd made while he was asleep. I just nodded, not wanting to break the illusion. But while he brushed his teeth at the water spigot, I walked over to the next site about 50 yards through the trees. A couple from Tennessee, Brenda and Chuck, were sitting at their picnic table having coffee. I asked if they'd heard anything strange during the night, tried to sound casual about it. Brenda's eyes lit up immediately. She said they'd both heard footsteps between the tents sometime. After 2 in the morning. Heavy ones. Not animals. Someone circling the campsites. Chuck said he'd even gotten up to check thinking it might be a bear, but he didn't see anything. When they asked Earl about it that morning, he told them he hadn't left his cabin, said he never did night patrols after 10. Something in Brenda's tone told me she didn't fully believe him. Back at our site, Tyler was finishing up packing. I helped him load the gear into the car and told him we'd grab breakfast on the way back. Earl rolled by on his golf cart a few minutes later, doing his morning rounds. He asked how our stay was, and I mentioned the pine cone circle with a nervous laugh, like maybe it was a prank. His face went flat. The smile dropped completely. He looked past me toward the tent, then leaned in a little too close and lowered his voice. He said, this wasn't the first time. That for the last couple of months, folks had been reporting strange things. Soft tapping, arranged objects, footsteps circling tents in the early hours of Saturday mornings, always in the more isolated sites, always just one occupied tent per loop. But when they checked the records, no one else had been booked in those areas. No signs of anyone else ever being there. Just stories, and shapes, and objects moved quietly in the dark. We left right after that. I didn't look back. Tyler slept most of the ride home, mouth open, oblivious. I kept one hand tight on the wheel and the other checking the rear-view mirror more than I probably needed to. That night, after Sarah asked how the trip went, and Tyler showed her pictures of his muddy shoes and burned marshmallows, I sat down and looked up the name Whispering Pines online. There were forums, old ones, buried deep, posts going back years, people describing the same things. Tapping, circles, the same unease. One woman said she'd left a trail camera outside her tent after a similar night. In the morning, the camera was turned backward, aimed at the base of a tree. The memory card was gone. We never went back. Tyler still asks about going camping sometimes. I always say, maybe next summer, maybe when the weather's better. But the truth is that tent's still in the garage, and I haven't unrolled it since. Not after seeing those 5 pine cones. Still sticky with sap. Still placed in a circle around where my son's head had been. Back in 2019, I took a solo backpacking trip into the Marble Mountains, one of those stretches of wilderness in Northern California that doesn't get much traffic outside of fire season. I was 29, a freelance travel photographer trying to reset after a rough year, and I'd convinced myself that a week away from cell towers and inboxes might finally clear my head. I'd done solo trips before, always with prep, always cautious. But that week, something about the quiet felt different. The plan was simple. Hike in for 2 days camp at a lake I'd seen on an old hikers forum, then head back before the weekend crowds hit the trail. The weather was perfect cool mornings, golden afternoons, and the kind of filtered light that makes even fallen pine needles look like art. I followed an unmarked spur trail that traced a ridgeline, then dropped down toward a basin that barely showed up on satellite maps. Sapphire Lake was the goal. I'd only seen one blurry photo of it online, but that was part of the appeal, no one else. Just me, my pack, and the forest. By the second day, I hadn't seen another person since early morning. My GPS said I was less than a mile from the lake, so I stopped to stretch and took a swig from my canteen. That's when I noticed something through the trees. Just a sliver of white metal, mostly hidden by brush and a low ridge of ferns. I thought maybe it was the sun catching on rock until I moved closer and saw it was a van. A full-sized white panel van. No windows in the back, like the kind plumbers or delivery guys use. There were no roads anywhere near there. No trail wide enough for a vehicle, no old logging tracks that hadn't long since been reclaimed by nature. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The van was wedged between two massive Douglas firs, branches bent and bark scraped where something had forced its way through. The tires were caked in dry mud. The hood was covered in pine needles and bits of moss. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't been there for more than a few weeks. The doors were closed, windows dark with dust and tree shadow. I didn't get closer than I had to, just enough to peek through the windshield and confirm it looked empty. There were no markings, no license plate. Nothing that told me who it belonged to or how it had ended up 50 miles from the nearest town. I snapped a couple photos, mostly for my own records, then backed off. The air around the van felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just heavy in a way that made my stomach tighten, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I continued to the lake. It was beautiful, clear, glacial water surrounded by stone and silence. I set up my tent in a flat patch between two boulders and got a fire going before sunset. I should have been relaxed. That was the whole point. But I kept glancing back toward the direction I'd come from, wondering if maybe I'd imagined it, or worse, if someone had seen me near it. After dinner, I sat by the fire with my camera reviewing shots from earlier. That's when I saw a flicker of light through the trees, faint like a dome light coming on in a car. I froze, staring into the dark, barely breathing. The light flickered off, then back on again. Not fast, not panicked, just controlled. I turned off my own lantern and sat in the dark, trying to listen past the sounds of the forest. No wind, no crickets, no frogs near the shoreline. Just the occasional drip of water off moss and the steady thump of my pulse. After about 10 minutes, the light disappeared completely. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe an old battery finally dying. Maybe I'd imagined it. But then, sometime around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car door closing. Not slammed, just closed gently, followed by a second. I didn't move. My sleeping bag was unzipped and my boots were beside me in the tent, but I stayed perfectly still, trying to measure the distance of the sound. I couldn't. It bounced in strange ways between the rocks. Then came voices, two men, low tones speaking too softly for me to understand. Flashlight beams cut through the trees in careful sweeps, not random, not looking for a lost phone or animal. These were slow, practiced movements like they were searching for something. I crawled slowly to the back of the tent and unzipped it just an inch. I didn't stick my head out, just listened. One of the voices passed within 50 feet of my campsite. I heard brush crack under boots, the heavy kind with thick soles. One man radioed the other static and a clipped response. I caught the words north side and check again. I didn't move for almost an hour. Eventually, the lights went dark again. I didn't hear them leave, but I did hear a fire being started near where the van had been. Not a big one, just the soft snap of pine needles and dry wood. Then silence. I stayed up the rest of the night. When the first gray light hit the trees, I packed my bag as quietly as I could and left the tent behind. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I just moved, trying not to snap twigs or disturb the trail. My boots slid a few times on rock, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I hiked almost 8 miles that day, backtracking, until I finally got a single bar of signal on my phone. I called the sheriff's office and gave them my coordinates, told them about the van, the voices, the men, the lights. I think the dispatcher thought I was exaggerating, but she took the report and told me a ranger would be sent out. I got a call 3 days later from a deputy. They'd found the van, just like I described. It had been reported stolen from a town in Oregon 2 weeks earlier. Inside were tools, rope, zip ties, and what the deputy called items used to restrain people. No sign of the men, no camp, no fire pit, just the van and some partial footprints in the moss. The deputy thanked me and told me I'd probably interrupted something. He said it casually, like he was talking about a break-in or a suspicious vehicle. But the way he paused before hanging up told me he wanted to say more. He didn't. I've thought a lot about what I saw, about how much worse it could have gone if I'd stayed another night or let curiosity pull me closer. I've done other solo trips since then, but not deep ones. Not the kind where there's no cell service and no one for miles. I still carry that photo of the van on my camera's SD card. I haven't shown anyone, but I keep it as a reminder. Some things in the woods don't want to be found, and sometimes when you find them, they're not surprised at all. I don't usually notice license plates, but I remember that one. It had 2 matching 7s at the end, and it always pulled up at the same time every night just before I started counting the drawer. I was working the overnight shift at a gas station about 12 miles outside Alamosa. Nothing fancy. 2 pumps, flickering signs, single security camera, angled at the lot. The kind of place truckers pull into when they've got nothing left in them, or when they've misjudged the mileage before the next town. I'd been working there 3 years by then. My boss didn't care much what I did, as long as the drawer balanced and no one got stabbed. So I brought a book sometimes, or let the coffee burn down in the pot until it smelled like toast. The first time I noticed him, it was probably because of the way he moved slow, like he wasn't in a hurry, even though it was freezing out. His hoodie was pulled up tight, but he didn't shiver, didn't glance around or wave or come inside. Just pumped $12 flat, replaced the nozzle, like it weighed nothing, and drove off without a word. It struck me because who pays exactly $12 for gas, not 10, not 15, 12, even not a penny over? I remember checking the receipt afterward. $1,200. Paid. At pump. I didn't think much of it at the time, just filed it away as one of those odd things you see working nights. But then he came back. Same car, same hoodie, same pump, same $1,200. And at the exact same time, 3:17 a.m. I remember checking the wall clock because it had just ticked over from 3:16 when his headlights came through the fog. I watched him again. No phone, no music, didn't look at me, didn't even glance toward the building. $12. Gone. After the 3rd night in a row, I started keeping track. I wrote the time and amount on a sticky note behind the register. $12 at 3:17, every night, for 9 nights straight. There was something rigid about it, like he was following a pattern he didn't want to break. I'd never seen the car around town, never saw it drive off toward the mountains or into the city. It just came from the south, pulled in, pumped $12, and disappeared the same way it came. By night 5, I stopped pretending not to watch. I'd wait behind the counter with the screen dimmed and all the lights off except the security floodlight. And sure enough, like clockwork, the headlights would break the fog, and I'd feel that weird pressure again, like the silence was pushing in from the walls. The guy never looked up, never changed clothes. I couldn't even tell what he looked like under the hood. His movements were mechanical, not in a drugged way, but practiced, like he was redoing something he'd already done hundreds of times. One night I tried to follow him. I got in my truck and let him pull a good distance ahead. But there wasn't much traffic at that hour, and the only road south was a 2-lane stretch lined with frozen fields. After about 3 miles, his taillights blinked out. No turnoff, no sign of him. Just gone. I drove all the way to the next crossroad. Nothing. I checked the security camera the next day, just to see if I was misremembering. But it showed what I'd seen his car pulling in at exactly 3:17. You could see the glow of the pump numbers, 12 even. His figure standing there in the blue hoodie. Back to the camera. Never turning around. I called dispatch the next night. Not 911, just the state patrol line for our county. Told them I thought someone might be doing something weird with the pumps. The dispatcher was polite, but didn't sound especially concerned. Probably just someone running a route, she said. You see the same trucks all the time on Graveyard. But it wasn't a truck. And there was no company decal, no license number I could make out. Just a quiet silver sedan that never left tire tracks. By the 10th night, I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped outside, left the register unattended, and stood under the yellowish glare of the overhang. He pulled in just like always, and I walked right up to him, not close enough to spook him, but enough that he couldn't ignore me. He didn't flinch, didn't even glance my way, just slid the nozzle back in place and turned toward his door. I said, "Hey man, you good? You've been coming here every night, same time, same pump. What's that about?" He stopped. I thought maybe he was going to say something. His head tilted slightly like he'd heard me. Then he got in the car, shut the door, and drove off. That night, he didn't come back. I waited the next 2 nights. I stayed past shift, sitting in my truck out by the ice machine, just in case. But nothing. The fog rolled through like always. The clock hit 3:17 and kept ticking. On the 3rd night, I figured maybe it was over. Maybe he'd found another station. I started to feel a little stupid, wondering if I'd read too much into it. Then the trooper came by. Pulled in around 2:30, said he was just grabbing coffee. He asked if I'd seen a silver sedan with out-of-state plates. Said there'd been a report about someone matching that car's description last seen near Blanca. I mentioned the guy, the hoodie, the time, the pattern. The trooper's expression changed just a little. He took a breath, leaned on the counter. Thing is, he said there was a crash on 285 2 weeks ago. Silver sedan went off the embankment during a snow squall. Guy didn't make it. But we couldn't get a positive ID. Fire had already gotten to the car. I said something like, "You sure it was the same car?" He didn't answer right away. Just looked at the security monitor over my shoulder, the one aimed at pump 2. Then he said, "I'll make a note. If he comes back, give me a call." I haven't seen the man since. But sometimes at 3:17, the motion sensor light on pump 2 flickers on. No wind, no car, just the faint hum of the overhead bulb warming up like it's waiting for someone. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those memories that makes people tilt their head when you tell it, like they're waiting for a punchline that never comes. Back in 2018, I worked at a small, privately owned funeral home just outside of Billings. It was the kind of job you don't grow up wanting, but you fall into when you need work, and you're quiet by nature. I helped with flower arrangements, scheduling light cleaning, and making sure viewings went smoothly. Most of the time, that meant standing off to the side, while grief moved through the room in whatever shape it needed to. Some families cried openly. Others kept their coats on the whole time and left early. Grief doesn't follow a script, and neither did we. The viewing in question was for a man named Lester J. Knox. I remember the name because I typed it out on a dozen little placards and guest book signs. He was in his late 70s, survived by 2 daughters and a sister who flew in from Arizona. The service was quiet, reserved, maybe 10, 12 people, all of them polite, subdued, and visibly tired. We held the viewing in Chapel Room B, which was the smaller one with peach-colored walls and frosted windows that faced the alley. The service ended around 6:30 that evening. People lingered until just before 7, offering soft condolences and hugging in the hallway before heading out to the parking lot. I walked through with a tray to collect used tissues and abandoned programs. I checked the water pitcher, straightened the chairs, and gave Mr. Halverson a nod to let him know the chapel was clear. That's the part that sits with me, because I know without any doubt that I locked the door to Chapel B when I left. Not just the hallway door, but the side door too, the one that leads into the embalming prep area. I remember the click of both locks. I remember checking the light switch. I even remember pausing to smooth out a crease on the guest book table as I left. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. About an hour later, I was in the office finishing up paperwork when I heard the chapel door unlatch. It wasn't loud, just a soft metallic shift, the kind you learn to recognize when the building is mostly empty. My first thought was that maybe Mr. Halverson had gone back in, or that someone from the family had returned to pick up a forgotten scarf or earring. So I got up, walked the corridor slowly, and turned the corner into the chapel hallway. And there he was, a man in a dark suit just stepping out of Chapel B. He wasn't anyone I'd seen during the service, that much I was sure of. He was tall, thin, maybe mid-40s, with close-cropped black hair and heavy, dark-rimmed glasses. He didn't look at me when he exited the room, just walked calmly past, turned right down the hallway, and let himself out the side entrance. I didn't even think to say anything until the door had already closed behind him. That's when I realized something else. The lights were off in the chapel. He'd come out of a dark room. I peeked inside and flipped the switch on. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. Chairs in neat rows, podium empty, guest book table in place. The only difference was that someone had signed the guest book again. A new signature in a sharp, slanted script near the bottom. Just visiting. There was no name, no timestamp, no contact information. Just those 2 words written in pen that hadn't been there an hour earlier. I remember standing there with the guest book in my hands, trying to make sense of it. The pen was ours. A standard black gel pen from the office drawer. It hadn't been moved. but the message was real. I turned around and double-checked the locks again. Both doors had been relocked from the inside. I mentioned it to Mr. Halverson the next morning. He's not the kind of man who spooks easily, but he raised an eyebrow and asked to see the guest book himself. He read the line paused, then set the book down without comment. When I asked if he recognized the man I described, he said simply, "People handle loss in all sorts of strange ways," and moved on to that day's schedule. But here's the thing. I couldn't let it go. I started checking the security camera feed from the hallway. The system was old and a little grainy, but clear enough to show people coming and going. I found the exact timestamp, 7:53 p.m. You can see me walk down the hallway, then pause. Then a tall figure exits Chapel B right past the camera. He walks directly past me without a word, turns the corner, and disappears toward the exit. But there's a blank spot, about 4 minutes of static right around. The time I would have locked that door earlier in the evening. Every other part of the feed is intact. I had the sense not to tell anyone else about it. Not my boyfriend at the time, not my parents, not even the other assistant who worked Wednesdays. What would I say anyway? That someone visited a locked chapel, signed an anonymous message, and left without a trace. That the feed had a gap exactly when it shouldn't. A few months later, we hosted another service in that same room. A different family, a different setup. I wasn't thinking about it until I glanced at the guest book after cleanup and saw it again at the very bottom of the page. Just visiting. Same handwriting, same ink. No one had signed anything during cleanup, and I had eyes on the chapel door the entire time. By the third time it happened, and it did happen. A third time 2 years later during a service, I wasn't even working. I'd stopped asking questions. Mr. Halverson never brought it up again. He retired in 2021 and sold the place to a regional chain. I haven't set foot in the building since. But every now and then I think about that man walking out of a locked room, not rushing, not hiding, just moving calmly like he belonged there, like he'd been waiting for everyone else to leave. And I think about what it means to be just visiting a place like that after everyone has gone. I once spent a week driving through Nevada handling small claims for a regional insurance firm. Most of the towns along Highway 50 blur together in my memory, but there's one place I still think about at night. It wasn't anything dramatic that made it stand out, not at first. Just a cheap roadside motel where I decided to stop after driving too long through the desert. I remember pulling into the lot just before sunset. The sky was streaked orange and purple, but the land around me felt empty, almost flat. There was a glowing vacancy sign buzzing faintly in the dry air, and the office door stood propped open with a chipped ceramic frog. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old coffee and dust. The clerk, a woman in her late 60s, wore a pink sweater, even though it was 90 degrees outside. She gave me a room key on one of those oversized brass tags and told me I'd be in room 11 at the far end by the soda machine. The layout was simple, one long row of doors facing the lot, with faded numbers stenciled above each frame. As I walked down, I noticed the curtains in room 12 shifting slightly, even though no one stood near them. I chalked it up to the air conditioning vent, or maybe the breeze, though there hadn't been any breeze at all that evening. My own room was what I expected: thin carpet, stiff bed, a faint chemical smell of old cleaning solution. I didn't plan to spend much time there. I just wanted sleep. After showering, I sat by the window, finishing notes on a claim. That's when I heard a faint, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across carpet. It came from room 12, the one right next to mine. I thought maybe someone was rearranging furniture, though the sound went on far longer than it should have. At one point it paused, then started again with a dull thump that made the wall between us tremble slightly. I told myself it wasn't my business. Motels get all kinds of travelers, and plenty of them keep odd hours. But around midnight I stepped outside to get a soda, and I noticed something that stayed with me. Room 12's curtains were open, just a slit wide enough that the glow of the television inside spilled onto the walkway. Yet when I glanced in, the room looked completely bare. No furniture, no suitcase, no bedspread. Just an old television sitting on the floor, flickering blue. When I brought my soda back, the dragging sound had stopped. The silence made it worse somehow, like the motel itself was holding its breath. I lay in bed, half asleep, until a soft knock startled me. It wasn't at my door, but at the one next to mine. Room 12. 3 slow knocks, followed by nothing. I waited for someone to answer, but the silence stretched out until it almost felt deliberate. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. The desert sun washed everything in brightness, and the motel seemed ordinary again. Mrs. Prentice waved at me as I left to inspect a claim in town. When I returned in the afternoon, though, I noticed room 12's door was cracked open just slightly. From where I stood, I could see inside. The room was empty. No television, no curtains, no carpet. It looked stripped, as though no one had stayed there in months. I asked Mrs. Prentice about it when I picked up ice from the office. She blinked, then shook her head. "We don't use that one," she said. "Hasn't been rented out in years." I mentioned that I had seen the light on the television glowing and even heard noises through the wall. Her face hardened in a way that told me I shouldn't press. She simply said, "You're in 11. Just keep your key and don't worry about 12. That night I tried to settle in early, but around 2 in the morning I woke to the distinct sound of water running. It was faint at first, then steady like a shower left on full blast. The noise was coming from the wall I shared with room 12. I sat on the edge of my bed listening until it stopped as abruptly as it began. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. I couldn't shake it anymore. I stepped outside barefoot on the warm pavement and stared at room 12. The door stood completely shut, yet thin light flickered beneath it. A television, maybe, or something trying to make me believe it was a television. I thought about knocking, even opening the door, but some instinct rooted me in place. My skin prickled all over, and I realized the sound of the running water had returned, but this time it wasn't muffled. It was loud, rushing, almost as though it were pouring into the empty lot around me. Yet when I looked down, the pavement was bone dry. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed my things and left the key on the counter without waking Mrs. Prentice. As I walked past room 12, I noticed something that made me quicken my pace. The brass number plate that should have read 12 was missing. In its place were faint, scraped outlines, as though the number had been pried off years ago. To this day, I don't know what I heard through that wall. I only know that when I drove away, the vacancy sign buzzed behind me in the rearview mirror, and for a moment I could have sworn the door to room 12 opened just a crack. That was one of the places that never left me, no matter how many years have passed. I've stayed in plenty of motels since then, some cleaner, some rougher, but none that carried that same quiet wrongness. Looking back on all these stories, I realize they share a thread, ordinary places that should have faded from memory, yet they linger because of something I can't explain. It isn't the dramatic moments that stay with us, it's the details. The hum of a sign at midnight, the scrape of furniture when no one's there, the way someone says not to ask questions. Those fragments become heavier than whole days we've lived. When you put them all together, you start to see a pattern. Highways, small towns, motels, airports, places where people pass through and rarely look back. Yet those are exactly the spots where silence hangs the longest. Maybe it's because they don't want to be remembered. Maybe it's because we're not supposed to notice. But once you do, you carry it forever like a faint noise in the background of your thoughts. Thank you for staying with me until the end of tonight's stories. I hope they've given you something to think about as you drift off to sleep. If you'd like to hear more, please follow the channel, share this with someone who enjoys quiet unease, and subscribe for future nights. And tell me, have you ever stayed somewhere that didn't seem strange until afterward, when the memory wouldn't let go? I'd like to hear your story. Sleep well, and good night.